Good evening, everyone. Really nice to see all of you here tonight. Welcome to the historic Lanphear Livery and the Conservancy's beautiful community gathering space, the Chaplain B. Barnes Reading Room. My name is Barbara Axmacher, and I am the Executive Director here at the Watch Hill Conservancy. Before we begin tonight's presentation, as we like to do every week, we want to take a moment to acknowledge our 2024 community programming sponsors. This year, 16 generous businesses and families agreed to sponsor our work, and with their support, we are able to defray the cost of our reading room public programming, general educational programming, as well as the care and maintenance of this meeting space. So please take a minute and join me in thanking them for their generosity. Additionally, I would also like to acknowledge the efforts of our staff, Daniel Cole, Becky Wilson, Tommy Papadilla, Chris Polinsky, and Emma Bean, for their assistance is critical to the success of tonight's lecture. Yes, definitely. Finally, I invite you to join us next Monday evening, August 26th at 6 p.m. right here in the reading room for the Watch Hill Conservancy annual meeting and a special presentation entitled Exploration and Education on Napatri, a 25-year history, with Chief Science Advisor Dr. Peter August and Watch Hill environmental educators Steve Brown and Hugh Markey. In celebration of our 25th anniversary, this lecture will highlight two of our iconic Conservancy programs, the Napatri Youth Education Program, The Investigators, and our stewardship of Napatri Point Conservation Area. Come learn about kids discovering coastal conservation while exploring the shore and the amazing scientific discoveries that we are finding on Napatri. So please stop by, enjoy a few light refreshments, and even a piece of birthday cake. And now I would like to turn the microphone over to Dr. Peter August, our President and Chief Science Advisor. Thank you.
And let me add one more name to the shout-out list, and she is the invisible Oz behind the curtain that makes all of this happen, and that's Janice Sassy. Janice has been coordinating all of our Lanphear Live presentations from the very beginning, and all the correspondence and logistics and arrangements with our terrific cast of speakers. Janice does all that. So let's give Janice a big round of applause too. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce to you tonight our speaker, Charlotte Taylor. The Rhode Island Historical Preservation and Heritage Commission is a state agency overseeing historic preservation and heritage programs. The commission identifies and protects historic and prehistoric sites, buildings, and districts by nominating significant properties to the National Register of Historic Places and the State Register. They administer grants, loans, and tax credits for rehabilitation of historic buildings, the Lanphear Livery for one, and they review federal and state projects that affect our cultural resources. And finally, they regulate the archaeological exploration on state lands and under state territorial waters. Charlotte Taylor is the state archaeologist for the commission. Her work includes maintaining an inventory of the location and condition of the state's shipwrecks. She oversees the work of archaeologists working on them and occasionally dives on the sites herself. She's a very, very busy person. On a per square mile basis, Rhode Island has more shipwrecks than any other state in the country. Thousands of ships have come to grief in Rhode Island waters through bad weather, human error, equipment failure, and military action. Some of these shipwrecks were epic disasters with many fatalities and a total loss of the vessels. Others were relatively minor misfortunes in which the ships were salvageable. Those that weren't salvageable are now archaeological sites most still waiting to be studied. Charlotte will present what we've learned and what we have still left to learn from underwater archaeology in Rhode Island, alongside stories of the most memorable shipwrecks here in the Ocean State, of which many occurred here in Westerly and Watch Hill. Charlotte did her graduate studies in archaeology at Brown. She's the author of the recent book, Images of America, Rhode Island Shipwrecks. If she piques your curiosity, she has some that you can purchase here tonight. This is a collection of historic photographs of Rhode Island shipwrecks. I think everyone needs a copy of this book because when you're having a rough day, give it a scan and you'll discover what a real bad day is like. So please join me in welcoming Charlotte Taylor.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. So when I came to Brown, I started studying underwater archaeology. And the fieldwork that I did was down in Florida in the Dry Tortugas. One of these underwater archaeologists is in Florida, and one of them is in Rhode Island. Can you guess which one is working in Rhode Island? Yes, you can. The conditions are rather grim here. But nevertheless, people persist. So I unfortunately don't get a chance to dive much anymore. I am now a bureaucrat. Pieces of paper come across my desk in great quantities. And I am the archaeologist at the old State House. And so archaeologists are traditionally put in the basement, so that is where I work. Far from the water, far from interesting shipwrecks. But still, I do get to think about shipwrecks and cultural resources as part of my job. This map shows what the sea level would have looked like about 11,000 years ago. And you can see that it was possible to walk to Block Island. All of this beige is dry land. And there were people living here then. There would have been megafauna that were hunted by Paleo-Indians on these areas of the state waters that are now submerged. And so one of the things that I have to consider is the effects of underwater cables on possible Paleo-Indian submerged sites. Remote sensing is such now that you can send beams into the bottom of the ocean and see where channels of rivers and streams would have been with terraces next to them. So this is a little stream that would have been out on the continental shelf 11,000 years ago. And when we locate features like this, we ask the people putting the cables to avoid them as much as possible. Obviously, we can't put a cofferdam into the middle of Block Island Sound to excavate a feature such as this. It would be incredibly difficult. And we could send divers down to move the sediment, but they're 60, 70, 80 feet deep, and so that too would be a prohibitive undertaking. So we try to avoid them as much as possible. Future archaeologists might actually get a chance to look and see if there are Paleo-Indian sites under our waters. Occasionally you hear tell of sport divers bringing mammoth bones up, and not sport divers, sport fishermen bringing up mammoth bones in their nets with Paleo-Indian points embedded in them. So we know that off the whole continental shelf of the Atlantic, there were Paleo-Indians hunting. We haven't found an actual site here in Rhode Island, but we are hopeful. This is a map of Greenwich Bay, and everything that's red is a known Indian site. The green is just a 5-meter difference in sea level. So everything that is green there would have been dry land 11,000 years ago, even 9,000 years ago. And so it's really easy to imagine some of these places where people lived extending off into the ocean. And indeed, there's one site off of Buttonwoods there in Warwick where people have been collecting Native American projectile points that are washing up on the beach. This is a range of points, not tremendously old, maybe 5,000 to 3,000 years old. And so Dave Robinson of URI, with other archaeologists, went to look to see if a Paleo-Indian site could be found under Greenwich Bay. And they did corings and they screened sediment, and sadly they did not find one. But we will still hope that someday we get one. The first shipwrecks of Rhode Island that we know of come from the 17th century. At that time, Block Island Sound and Narragansett Bay would have been busy with the dugout canoes of the Narragansetts and the other Native American tribes. You can see a contemporary artist's portrayal of what these dugout canoes might have looked like. And Roger Williams often went boating with his friends, the Narragansett. And he gave us a list of really useful phrases to say when you are out on a dugout canoe in the middle of Block Island. Things like, "We shall be drowned," "We overset," "The sea comes in too fast upon us," "Be of good courage," "It is wonderful how, being oft overset as I myself have been among them, they swim a mile, yea 2 or more, safe to land." So unfortunately, dugout canoes make really bad shipwrecks because, of course, they are floating logs. So even when they turn turtle, they will continue to float off and they will not fall to the bottom of Block Island Sound to become archaeological sites. However, freshwater lakes are really, really good at preserving wood, including dugout canoes. And during the winter months, it seems like the Native Americans would store dugout canoes in bodies of fresh water. These are not from Rhode Island. They're from Quinsigamond Lake up in Massachusetts. And you can see that they filled the dugout canoe with rocks to keep it down at the bottom of the lake, and how beautifully they're preserved. They could be brought up fresh and still used, which is the miracle of fresh water. Salt water is full of teredo worms and other environmental factors that decay the wood, but fresh water does not. So we might not have dugout canoes or Paleo-Indian sites, but we do have a lot of shipwrecks. This is by every green diamond is a shipwreck, and this is by no means all of them. This is a rather old map of shipwreck locations. And you can see that here in Westerly, you have a nice little share of green diamonds. So each of those is a known shipwreck site. And none of those shipwreck sites have been investigated by archaeologists. There just isn't it's so expensive to excavate a shipwreck and so time consuming that no one has tried, and it's someday. The only shipwrecks that have been excavated by archaeologists in Rhode Island are from the Revolutionary War. And just as a bit of background for those shipwrecks, the British had captured Newport and were using it as the base of their operations. And in the first combined action with the French, the Americans marched their army down to besiege Newport from the land, and the French were supposed to come in from the sea and bombard the city. The English had their ships of war, their frigates, up at the top of the bay, and they did not want those frigates falling into French hands to be used against them. So when the French fleet approached, the British deliberately scuttled their own ships of war. One of them, the Lark, scuttled up near Portsmouth, was also blown up, and flying timbers went 2 miles inland. So the remains of those ships have been found. By the way, the French decided not to come after all. They got caught in bad weather, and life happened, and so the Americans had to march all the way back up to the top of the island again. But we were left with 4 sunken British frigates. This is what a shipwrecked British frigate, partially blown up and scuttled, looks like. Everything that's a little shape is something that is sticking up out of the mud. And you can see that this does not scream shipwreck. It screams the little blobs on the surface of the... However, if you know that you're looking at a British frigate, some things become clearer. So these frigates were discovered, the sites of the frigates were discovered by a man named Al Davis, who was an oceanographer at the University of Rhode Island. And he was not an archaeologist, but he did find the shipwrecks. Little bits of wood under the silt, and lots of artifacts. Since he was not an archaeologist, he did not record where the artifacts were within the ship. He simply recovered them. So he and his divers would just fill bags with artifacts and bring them to the surface. And there's shoes and glass and buckles and buttons and lots pieces of tackle. And the problem with this is that when you record where the artifacts are from, you can actually start telling a story about what happened on the ship. The sailors that were on these vessels were given 30 minutes to get everything off. so they left a lot behind. One of the things that was found from one of the frigate sites was about 30 shoes, pieces of leather, such as this. And so the sailors were presumably walking off barefoot or in their shoes. And so why would 30 pairs of 30 shoes be left behind? Well, if they had all been in one part of the ship, they could have been someone's hoard. We know that the British had just raided a cobbler's shop on Newport. They were plundering Newport for anything they could take and sell once they got back home. So maybe we had a shoe hoarder on board. But because we don't know where on the site the shoes were from, they could have just been the party shoes of various sailors. We will never know. As well as the frigates, the British scuttled transport ships to blockade the harbor. So imagine you're trying to blockade your harbor. You sink your ship so that the masts are sticking up to make a fence along the perimeter of it, so the frigates, the French vessels can't get close enough to bombard the city. Each of these little dots, is a transport that was sunk in Newport Harbor. These were pretty scuzzy ships. They were used to basically, when you are raiding Prudence Island for cattle or going to Long Island for wood, these were the ships that you'd take with and you'd load the stuff in and take them back home again. They were originally to carry troops over from England, and then they just persisted here. 2 of them were used as prison ships. But we don't know which ships were sunk where. So 2 prison ships within that collection. And one of those prison ships turned out to be Captain Cook's ship Endeavour that he sailed to Australia. And so this shipwreck is to Australia as the Mayflower would be to New England. And so when Kathy Abbas of the Marine Archaeology Project, a volunteer organization that trains sport divers in the basics of archaeology and then starts documenting shipwrecks here in Rhode Island, she was doing research and discovered this connection. And the Australian National Maritime Museum was very eager to find which transport was the Endeavour. So they were able to fund several field seasons of actual archaeology, like mapping and recording underwater, to try to figure out which the Endeavour was. Because although RIMAP has the enthusiasm and the divers on hand, RIMAP lacks the money to actually carry out an excavation. Especially because once you start disturbing the silt on a shipwreck such as this, you start seeing the artifacts. And the artifacts then need to be conserved. So any of you thinking about excavating a shipwreck know that it will take you 3 times as long to do the conservation, and it will cost you about 20 times as much as it is to actually take the things off the site. So think carefully when you meet them. So these are what the transports look like. This is what's left of them. The most prominent feature is the piles of ballast. Ballast stays put pretty nicely. Some of them have cannons on them, ding, ding, and some of them have wooden timbers that are periodically exposed. And obviously there's not anything sticking up, no frames sticking up. Obviously these are pretty damaged sites. So it's possible that if you got every bit of the rotten wood from each of the transport sites up and put them in a row, you might be able to say, yes, that one is the Endeavour. But doing archaeology, they found that there is one site that meets the criteria of being the Endeavour, but they haven't shown that no other site in the group also meets that criteria. So there's a good candidate, but there's not any certainty yet. So moving on past the Revolutionary War. In the 19th century, the steamship traffic just exploded in Rhode Island waters, and barges full of coal passed back and forth through Block Island Sound, as well as your pleasure craft and your fishermen. It was just a busy, busy place, and there were lots of shipwrecks. The town of Westerly appreciated shipwrecks. And about this postcard says, watching a wreck off Lighthouse Point. So all of these people are basically you. You are here to watch wrecks. And the wreck presumably was just sitting there, so they were watching it, and it wasn't moving. But the newspaper at the time said, if the wreck that is currently on our shores persists through the summer, it will draw many visitors. So wrecks were an important driver of local tourism. Such as this. This is, anybody would want to go watch that attractive wreck. This is your basic 19th century schooner. Probably the Nellie Vaughan gone ashore on the shores of Watch Hill. Not a very interesting story, just someone had a bad day. This, however, is one of your Watch Hill's best maritime disasters, second best, really. This is the wreck of the Metis. The steamship Metis left New York City in August of 1872, going overnight to Providence, full of passengers. And in the middle of the night, it had an unfortunate encounter with a passing schooner. They played a game of chicken, and it went badly when the schooner went into the Metis. And so although she was taking on water, they thought that she might be able to make it to shore. Because if you're taking on water in the middle of the ocean, obviously you make to shore to ground yourself so that people can escape. But they were still about 4 miles off. And they launched their lifeboats, and there were only 4 lifeboats for the 180 or so people on board, so that went poorly. And this is what ended up happening. These are all people and bits of wreckage crashing around in the waves. The Lighthouse Saving Service at Watch Hill sprang into action, and they were able to bring 32 people safely to shore. But sadly, at least 50 people didn't make it. The beach was littered with debris from this. Sorry, this is a poor image. But that people who were tired of just watching wrecks went and participated by picking up pieces of wrecks as souvenirs. So if any of you are longtime Watch Hill Westerly residents or have family that are, they probably have bits of the Metis sort of rotting away in their basements and attics. So if you ever clean out a house here and find a bit of rotten wood, it's probably a Metis souvenir, because they were very popular at the time. So that was a pretty bad maritime disaster. But this one is even better as these things go. When steam meets sail, steam is supposed to yield the right of way, but in practice there can be problems with this, as happened with the Larchmont, a passenger steamship making the same journey as the Metis between New York and Providence. It was a bitterly cold and windy night, however, in February, not the pleasant August wrecking season for the Metis enjoyed. And the round trip turned into disaster when the Larchmont was struck by the Harry Knowlton, a 3-masted coal schooner. And what makes this a worse tragedy is that when the Larchmont was stuck, the steam lines below decks were punctured, and so everything below decks was immediately filled with scalding steam. So anybody that was below decks was toast. Soggy toast, but toast. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. So then some people made it to the decks and some were further up above the steam level. But those people were confronted with the 20-foot waves that were active that night. And they were covering everybody on board with ice because it's February and freezing. So the captain ordered the lifeboats launched, and again, there weren't enough of them. And within 15 minutes, they didn't even have a chance of getting to shore because 15 minutes later, the Larchmont was sunk. The lighthouse crew went out to try to save them, but to no avail. Some people managed to cling to the hurricane deck, the structure on the top of the vessel. And that was a horrible experience because it started out with about 20 people clinging to the hurricane deck, and every time a wave went over, there were fewer. And so I think only about 3 people made it to shore on the hurricane deck. So some survivors were picked up by a passing schooner, and some washed ashore on Block Island with the hurricane deck. The people of Block Island immediately tried to help whoever they could, but unfortunately, after being in the ocean in February, I feel that this caption on this postcard is a little optimistic. It says, "Removing the survivors from the life-saving station." These people totally covered in blankets, we can hope that they're just being warmed, but they don't, one is not hopeful. And there's more. They had to collect all the dead frozen bodies, and some of them had frozen in their little swimming positions, and it was a terrible, terrible thing. This is the enemy ship, the Harry Knowlton, and that on its bow is the bits of the Larchmont. The Harry Knowlton managed to get to shore, and the crew abandoned ship and made it to safety. And it eventually went aground on Weekapaug Beach in Westerly. The cargo of coal was salvaged, and the ship has broken to pieces that same month. So possibly under the sand there are pieces of Harry Knowlton left to be uncovered by future storms. The year now is 1887, and it's November. The three-masted schooner Maggie J. Smith is going from New York with a cargo of coal for Portsmouth, New Hampshire. In rough seas kicked up by a southwest gale, she hit the reef running from the Bass Rock 2 miles to the south of Narragansett Pier Life-Saving Station. The captain had apparently mistook a light in a house on Narragansett Beach for Beaver Tail Light, and so was trying to go to the left of the house on the shore, and that did not work out well. And the Maggie Smith had an auxiliary steam engine, even though she was a sailing vessel, and they were able to use her steam engine to make hoots of distress that summoned the life-saving crew, who rescued those on board and gave them, as the newspaper reported, stimulating drinks. Perhaps the captain had already had too many stimulating drinks. And that is what she looked like aground there. The Maggie Smith could not be saved, and her wooden hull was eventually picked up by the waves and tossed ashore. This is an oil steamer, the Swift Star, which became a casualty of Block Island's rocky coast and foggy weather in October of 1922. This doesn't really look like an exciting shipwreck. It just looks like a ship that's gone aground, but it's a good story. The crew at first remained with the ship, and at 6 o'clock the next morning after they went aground, a tug from New England tried to assist but was unable to. Conditions worsened on board. The pumps fouled with sand, the 2 boilers cut out, the engine room and fire room tank tops had also gone. At 10 a.m., the crew realized they would have to abandon ship by nightfall, and an hour later the engine room flooded. The captain and some of the crew left quickly in one of the ship's boats, leaving 33 men on board with no way to get off. Happily, so the top picture is a tug trying to pull it free of the rocks, and it failed. But happily for the people left on board, there was a passing submarine cruising at the surface of the water that saw what was happening and pulled up alongside, and so all the 33 people on the Swift Star were able to get in the submarine and go to safety, and were landed on Block Island. The fog lifted in the afternoon, and according to the Worldwide Wireless Report, the, quote, usual curious natives were gathered at the beach to look at the Swift Star offshore. Once the damage to her mangled hull in the bottom right was repaired, she went back to sea only to disappear a year later while passing through the Panama Canal. So, no submarines there to save her crew. So. This is another Block Island shipwreck, the Spartan, and it also fell victim to early morning fog. Chances of saving the steamship seemed good, so the captain declined aid from salvors, hoping to work her afloat again at high water. He couldn't. The waves picked up and began to break over the ship, and so signals of distress were raised. The local life-saving crew came to the rescue and took the Spartan's crew off with the breeches buoy. This is a breeches buoy. It is basically a life preserver with rubber pants attached to it. The crew on land would fire with a small gun the line to the ship, which would be made fast, and then like a zip line, you would go back and forth on the rubber pants. This is relevant to Westerly because, as well as shipwrecks, one of your tourism attractions was the lighthouse crew practicing with their breeches buoy, and tourists, if they were lucky, got to ride in the rubber pants back and forth. So they should bring that back. That would be really cool. So anyway, they got everybody off the Spartan. The Spartan has been visited by many divers, and unfortunately, one of them decided to make a project of recovering every single porthole from her that he could, making them into living room furniture. And as an archaeologist and someone who likes people to be able to see antiquities from the past, I so wish he hadn't done that, and that divers today could go down to the Spartan and see her wreck as it should have been with all its portals in place. However, many sport divers have contributed very much to our knowledge of Rhode Island shipwrecks, including two from Westerly who are here today, Charlie Buffum and Craig Harter. In 2011, they found a wreck that might well be that they thought might well be the Revenge. And in subsequent years, Navy divers visited the site and have recovered 2 cannon from it. One of these has markings dated from the period that we would expect. If you aren't familiar with the Revenge, this was before Oliver Hazard Perry became famous for his 1813 victory against the British in Lake Erie. He was patrolling local waters as a commander of the Revenge and ran aground on the Watch Hill Reef, attempting to navigate a hazardous stretch of water known as the Race in heavy fog. They threw everything overboard that they could to try to lighten the ship, but it was stuck fast on the rocks, and it eventually sunk, leaving a scatter of cannon and ballast around it. And so thank you, brave divers of Westerly, for locating the ship.
Yeah, all of 10 feet.
Yep. Okay. This is one of my absolute favorite maritime misfortunes. The Commonwealth was known as the giantess of the Sound. And on a foggy July morning in 1912, the battleship New Hampshire, that's the Commonwealth there, giantess of the Sound. The battleship New Hampshire was anchored in Newport Harbor on this foggy morning, and the Commonwealth was setting out into open water and did not see the large battleship that was in her way. There was fog. Battleships are gray. So the giantess of the Sound plowed straight into the Navy vessel. This is what happens when you're a Navy vessel plowed into by a large steamship. It is not pretty. And in fact, the public were really dismayed when these images became public. They were like, what is the Navy building? What sort of ships are these that are so easily crushed? But when you look at the Commonwealth underwater, you'll see that she's basically sheared off the below water part of her hull. And the Navy vessel looks awful above the water, but is intact below the water. And that is because cannons were no longer being used in naval warfare. Instead, we were using torpedoes. And so you would want the below water part to be heavily armored and not what is above that. And so the Navy vessel actually ended up still being seaworthy as long as you had no waves to contend with, and actually was the winner in the contest. This is also a nice steamship disaster. The steamship Boston was run down by an oil tanker off the shore of Narragansett in heavy fog, again with the fog. 4 individuals, the unfortunate occupants of these staterooms, were unfortunately killed by the contact with the Swift arrow crashing through the side of the ship. The New York Times reported that the occupant of a nearby inner cabin was woken up to find himself looking at the bow of the Swift arrow, sharing his room with him. Finding it too difficult to get dressed, even after the bow slowly withdrew again, he decided to go back to bed. In the meantime, they were waiting for hours for vessels to come from shore to evacuate them. And so 2 enterprising young women took a gramophone up to the top of the deck of the Boston and started an impromptu dance party to raise morale. So it's the submarine S-51, launched in 1921, was cruising on the surface about 14 miles off Block Island in September of 1925. The merchant steamer City of Rome spotted the lights of the submarine, but were unsure of the other vessel's course, speed, or intentions, and so they altered course away. And then they saw other lights, and again, a cat and mouse game. The submarine was continuing on its pace, but when it looked like the City of Rome was going to hit them, they made a hard turn. Unfortunately, the City of Rome did too, and bam, the city of Rome and the submarine collided. The city of Rome slammed into the port side of the submarine, carrying a gash in it, and the result was tragedy. Only 10 of the 36 men in the submarine escaped, and of those, 7 died in the cold water. Both vessels were found to be at fault. The city of Rome for not slowing down and not signaling her change of course, and the S-51 for having improper lights. The U.S. Navy argued that submarines were exempt from complying with regular rules about lights that other ships had to follow. And the judge was not impressed and said that submarines should then confine their operations to waters not being traversed by other ships. So the Navy had been having a run of bad press, and the loss of the submarine with its crew was very distressing. They decided that they would raise the sub and recover the bodies of the drowned men. Sport diving was still not the exact science it is today. There was an early Navy sport diver preparing to go in. They affixed pontoons to the submerged vessel to bring it to the surface, and they succeeded. And here it is being towed in its cradle of pontoons underwater into New York, the New York Navy Yard. So that submarine is not an archaeological site because it was lifted and recovered. This one, however, is an archaeological site. The last U-boat sunk in World War II. And this is the process of sinking. You drop the depth charges that explode on contact with the metal, and when you've sunk your submarine, you see the oil slick appear on the surface, and you get to paint a little picture of a submarine on your own vessel to show that you were responsible for the kill. So this submarine, the German submarine, is still off of Block Island. It's not actually in state waters, and it's still the property of the German government. Yep, because ships of war that go down with their flag still flying always remain property of the government. So the British frigates that I showed you before are also still property of the British government. The U.S. Navy takes care of them and is responsible for them, but they are not the state of Rhode Island's British frigates. Nor is this our submarine. However, sport divers have been visiting it for years, and apparently there's one diver who has been taking up pieces of one of the torpedoes, to try to reassemble them in his garage in Tiverton, in the Department of Neighbors you don't necessarily want. And there's also the crew of the submarine went down with the ship, and one body was actually recovered by divers who thought it would be fun to take up a German submariner and bring him home. And he's now buried in Newport. So Rhode Island has actually a Nazi grave in one of our cemeteries from the shipwreck. This is what the German submarine looks like in a high-resolution sonar image. And you can see that this is done by basically flying the equipment over the shipwreck, and it gives you the shadows of anything sticking up. And so you can see that it gives you a really good idea of how intact it is and what features might still be there. And here's a diver exploring the shipwreck, and one of the sort of souvenirs that people go down there to look for. Here's another submarine, the USS Bass. It was a V-2 submarine designed by Electric Boat and launched in 1942. You're looking at a failure right here. She failed at both seaworthiness and speed, and so she was decommissioned after only a few years. She was brought back in service for World War II, but tragically in 1942 a fire ripped through her and 26 of her crew were killed. And the Navy ended up using her as a target to test a top-secret acoustic homing torpedo in 1945. And at last she succeeded. She was a good target. They hit her and she sank. And so she lies in 155 feet of water south of Block Island. So obviously that is too far for divers to comfortably go. But with the side scans, with the sonar technology, we can see that there is still a lot of her still down there. And again, this is still a Navy vessel, property of the Navy, never relinquished by the Navy. not a Rhode Island shipwreck, even though it's in our waters. This unfortunate ship I include not just because it's a really cool picture showing beaver tail light and the vessel in distress, but because this is a case in which Rhode Island set an important precedent in the country. The oil tanker Thurtle went aground on the rocks south of Fort Wetherall in Jamestown early in the morning of September 1961. The rocks tore through her hull, and the Coast Guard estimated that by midday she had lost 28,000 barrels of oil and was still leaking. Approximately 339,000 gallons of bunker oil escaped from her tanks in the end, and thick, heavy oil coated the rocks of Jamestown and the beaches and rocks of Newport. She was, which was there for weeks before it was removed. The refining company that operated the tanker made payments totaling $65,990 to defray the cleanup costs incurred by the state and the municipalities of Newport and Jamestown. And this payment, reached by negotiation with no litigation, was the first of its kind for an oil spill disaster like this. Moving on to gales. Hurricanes have been going through Rhode Island for centuries. This is the downtown area of Providence during the Great Gale of 1815. So you can see a lot of the shipping was plunged into the downtown buildings. The Hurricane of '38 took out every single one of Jamestown's ferries, dashing them all to shore and rendering them useless. And interestingly enough, the people of Jamestown had voted just 3 months before the hurricane hit not to fund the construction of a new bridge. Strangely, after the hurricane, they were all in favor. This rather overexposed image is a local one for you all. This is the Granville R. Bacon. It mistook a street lamp for the light of a passing vessel. And that's what the report says, but it's very hard to imagine how if you see a light that you think is a passing vessel or a street lamp, either way you should avoid it. But this did not work out well, and it went ashore on the sand dunes in Quannacochog. And for years it sat there, but then the Hurricane of '38 picked it up. And this is the only shipwreck in Rhode Island that has ever taken down a house. It was dashed into a beach cottage with such force that it crushed the beach cottage. So, all of these shipwrecks in Rhode Island have left pieces of themselves on the shore. And these have drawn people to them. Wearing quite nice clothing, they pose in the bits of wreckage. This is one on Charlestown Beach. Not sure which actual shipwreck it is. You can see one person peeking out there, and the others. Imagine a bit of rotten wood on the beach and climbing up it in a dress, with nails sticking out of it. But these people are obviously in a competition to see how many people we can fit in a piece of shipwreck wreckage, because they're just all over the place, every nook and cranny. And this one is one that some of you might have seen. This is a 1970s aerial picture of the Charlestown Breachway. And there's a vessel there, probably the remains of a coal schooner or some such. Not enough left of it to tell what sort of vessel it was or what particular vessel it was. But every time there's a bad storm, not every time, but often when there's a bad storm, the wreckage gets uncovered, and I get a fresh round of calls saying, "There's a shipwreck by the breachway." And yes, indeed, there's a shipwreck by the breachway. Interestingly, the erosion on the other side of the breachway has also started exposing timbers from another shipwreck. And again, these are timbers from a ship. You can say that much, and it was a wooden vessel. But when you just have a few timbers like that, there's really not much you can say. And so those sort of sites aren't considered to be historically significant, listed on the National Register. To be listed on the National Register of Historic Places, a shipwreck has to have integrity. You have to be able to see the whole thing. You have to know which shipwreck it was, or what type of shipwreck at least, so that it contributes information and is not just a really interesting thing to go down and look at, which is the case of this one. If you want to see a shipwreck in the island, in the water, your best bet is to go to East Providence, where there was a marine railway going in to the top of Narragansett Bay. And on one side of it, they use this shallow shoal as a dumping ground for unwanted vessels. Each of these is a dumped derelict vessel. And some of them were vessels important to Rhode Island culture, like the Mount Hope, one of the famous little steamships that made the trip from Providence to Newport. And it was left there to rot, and at low tide you can see timbers sticking up from out of the water. So these are just a few of the shipwreck stories of Rhode Island. There's lots more. But I want to leave you with a safety message. This is a shipwreck. This is a lighthouse. Stay away from the lighthouses. And there's lots more, even better stories in Rhode Island shipwrecks. So thank you all very much, and I will turn it over to you.